What happens when Hollywood's most enigmatic actor sits down with a late-night host who thinks he can play psychological chess? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most explosive celebrity interviews ever recorded, where Johnny Depp faced off against Seth Meyers in a battle of wits that spiraled completely out of control. This isn't your typical promotional chat. This is raw, unfiltered tension that had the entire studio holding their breath. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're about to witness something truly unprecedented. The studio lights were blazing hot that evening as Johnny Depp settled into the guest chair across from Seth Meyers. The audience was electric with anticipation, expecting the usual charming banter between a beloved actor and his host. But from the moment Depp adjusted his signature rings and looked directly into Meyers' eyes, something felt different. There was an intensity in the air, a palpable tension that even the live audience could sense. "Johnny Depp, everyone," Meyers announced with his trademark grin, but there was something almost predatory in his expression. "Thanks for being here tonight. I have to say, you look tired." Depp's eyebrows raised slightly, a subtle shift that anyone who knew him would recognize as a warning sign. "Tired? That's an interesting way to greet a guest, Seth. I prefer the term weathered, like a fine piece of driftwood." The audience chuckled, but Meyers wasn't deterred. He leaned forward, his smile never wavering but his eyes growing sharper. "Right? Weathered. Speaking of which, I've been reading some interesting articles about your recent projects. Or should I say, lack thereof? It seems like Hollywood has been pretty quiet on the Johnny Depp front lately." There it was. The first jab. Depp's fingers drummed once against the armrest of his chair, a barely perceptible movement that spoke volumes. "You know, Seth, I've always found it fascinating how some people measure success. Box office numbers, headlines, the volume of noise one makes in this industry. But real artistry, real creativity, it doesn't always announce itself with fanfare." "Oh, absolutely," Meyers replied, his tone dripping with false agreement. "But surely you'd agree that visibility matters? I mean, when was the last time you had a major studio release? 2 years? 3? The question hung in the air like smoke. Depp's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "I think you're confusing visibility with desperation, Seth. Some of us choose our battles carefully rather than accepting every script that lands on our desk." "Interesting perspective," Meyers shot back, clearly enjoying himself. "Though I have to wonder if it's really about choice when the offers aren't exactly flooding in. I mean, let's be honest here, your last few films weren't exactly what you'd call critical darlings." The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the lighthearted interview they'd expected. Even the camera operators seemed to sense the growing tension, zooming in slightly to capture every micro-expression on both men's faces. Depp leaned back in his chair, his rings catching the studio lights as he steepled his fingers. "You know, what I find truly fascinating, Seth? The way some people build their careers on the failures of others. It's like watching vultures circle, waiting for the perfect moment to pick at the bones." "Vultures?" Meyers laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's a bit dramatic, don't you think? I'm just having a conversation with a guest. Isn't that what talk shows are for? Honest dialogue. Honest dialogue." Depp repeated slowly, savoring each word. "Is that what you call this? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels more like an interrogation masquerading as entertainment." The tension in the studio was now impossible to ignore. Audience members were glancing at each other, unsure whether they should laugh or remain silent. The production crew behind the cameras was frantically making hand signals, but Meyers seemed oblivious to everything except his target. "Come on, Johnny," Meyers pressed, his voice taking on a more aggressive edge. "You've been in this business long enough to know how it works. Success, failure, comeback, fall from grace, it's all part of the cycle. Some people handle it better than others." Depp's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the mask of Hollywood politeness slipped entirely. "And some people," he said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous undertone, "mistake cruelty for cleverness. They think that tearing down someone else somehow elevates them. But all it really does is reveal their own insecurities." "Insecurities?" Meyers scoffed. "I think you're projecting here, Johnny. I'm not the one who's been struggling to find work. I'm not the one whose personal life has been splashed across every tabloid for the past few years." The words hit like A physical blow. Depp's hands clenched slightly, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the arms of his chair. The audience was dead silent now, sensing they were witnessing something that had crossed a line from entertainment into something much more personal and ugly. You know what your problem is, Seth? Depp's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the stunned silence of the studio. You've spent so long hiding behind your desk, making jokes about other people's pain, that you've forgotten what it feels like to be human. You've become a parasite, feeding off the misery of others for laughs. Meyers' composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of genuine anger crossing his features before he recovered. A parasite? That's rich coming from someone who's made a living playing dress up and pretending to be other people. At least I'm honest about what I do. Honest. Depp stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The sound echoed through the silent studio like a gunshot. You want to talk about honesty? Let's talk about how you invited me here, under the pretense of promoting my work, only to ambush me with character assassination disguised as comedy. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. Meyers remained seated, but his body language had shifted, becoming more defensive even as he maintained his aggressive tone. I invited you here to have a real conversation, not to blow smoke up your ass like every other talk show host in Hollywood. A real conversation? Depp's voice rose slightly, his famous control beginning to fray at the edges. This isn't a conversation, Seth. This is a public execution, and you're the one holding the axe. The studio fell into an eerie silence as Depp towered over the seated host, his shadow falling across Meyers' desk like a dark omen. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing television history or about to become unwilling participants in a public meltdown. But Meyers, rather than backing down, seemed to feed off the chaos he'd created. Public execution? Meyers laughed, but it came out hollow and forced. Johnny, you're being incredibly dramatic. This is what I do every night. I ask questions, guests answer them. If you can't handle a few tough questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. Depp's eyes flashed dangerously. Tough questions? Is that what you call personal attacks wrapped in smug superiority? Because there's a difference between journalism and sadism, Seth, though I'm beginning to think you've never learned where that line is. Oh, please, Meyers shot back, his voice dripping with condescension. You've been in Hollywood for decades. You know how this game is played. Don't act like you're some innocent victim here. You put yourself in the spotlight, you deal with the consequences. The words seemed to physically strike Depp. His jaw clenched tight, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a tremor of barely controlled rage. Consequences? What consequences are those, Seth? The consequence of dedicating my life to my craft? The consequence of refusing to play by Hollywood's shallow rules? Or are you talking about the consequences of having my personal life dissected by people who wouldn't last 5 minutes in my shoes? Meyers leaned back in his chair, clearly relishing the reaction he'd provoked. I'm talking about the consequences of your choices, Johnny. Your career choices, your personal choices, all of it. You can't blame the media for reporting on what you do. What I do. Depp's voice rose, his famous composure finally beginning to crack. What exactly have I done that justifies this kind of treatment? Create art? Bring characters to life? Try to entertain people? Since when did that become a crime worthy of public humiliation? The production team was in full panic mode now, frantically signaling from behind the cameras, but Meyers ignored them completely. He was like a shark that had tasted blood in the water, circling for the kill. Come on, Johnny, let's not pretend your troubles are all about art. We both know there's more to the story than that. Depp went very still, his entire body tensing, like a coiled spring. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. More to the story? And what story would that be, Seth? The one you've constructed in your head based on tabloid headlines and gossip columns? Or are you referring to something specific? I'm referring to the fact that Hollywood is a business, Meyers continued, seemingly oblivious to the danger in Depp's tone. And businesses don't like risk. Maybe if you spent less time feeling sorry for yourself and more time taking responsibility for your situation, you'd understand that. The words hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Depp stared at Meyers for a long moment, his breathing deep and controlled. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low the microphones barely picked it up. Responsibility? You want to talk about responsibility? Let me tell you about responsibility, Seth. He began to pace behind his chair, his movements fluid but predatory. Responsibility is showing up on set every day, even when the world feels like it's crumbling around you. Responsibility is giving everything you have to a performance, even when directors and producers treat you like a commodity. Responsibility is trying to maintain some semblance of dignity while people like you make a living tearing you down for entertainment. Meyers shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but his voice remained defiant. That's a nice speech, Johnny, but it doesn't change the facts. The industry has moved on, and maybe it's time you did too. Moved on. Depp stopped pacing and turned to face Meyers directly. The industry has moved on to what, exactly? Manufactured personalities? Cookie-cutter performances? Actors who say exactly what they're supposed to say when they're supposed to say it, all in service of some corporate machine. It's moved on to professionalism, Meyers snapped, his own composure beginning to slip. To people who can separate their personal issues from their work. To actors who understand that they're part of something bigger than themselves. Depp's laugh was bitter and sharp. Professionalism? Is that what you call this ambush? Is this your idea of professional journalism? Because from where I stand, it looks more like a hit job disguised as an interview. The audience was completely captivated now, watching this verbal duel unfold with the horrified fascination of witnesses to a car crash. Some were pulling out their phones, trying to capture the moment, while others sat transfixed by the raw emotion on display. A hit job. Meyers' voice rose to match Depp's intensity. I'm giving you a platform to defend yourself, to tell your side of the story. Most people in your position would be grateful for the opportunity. Grateful. Depp's eyes blazed with fury. Grateful for the opportunity to be publicly humiliated by someone who thinks cruelty is comedy? You know what I'm grateful for, Seth? I'm grateful that after tonight, I'll never have to sit across from you again. Well, that might not be your choice to make. Meyers shot back, his mask of professional politeness finally slipping entirely. The way your career's been going, you might not be getting many more opportunities like this. The words hit their target with surgical precision. Depp's face went white, then flushed with anger. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the back of his chair, and for a moment, it seemed like he might actually lose control entirely. You know what your problem is, Seth? Depp's voice was barely recognizable, thick with rage and hurt. You've confused cynicism with intelligence. You think that by tearing down everything and everyone around you, you're somehow above it all. But you're not above anything. You're just a small, bitter man who's built a career on other people's pain. Meyers stood up suddenly, his own anger finally boiling over. And you're a washed-up actor who can't accept that his time is over. At least I'm honest about what I am. The confrontation had reached its breaking point. Both men stood facing each other across the desk, the air between them crackling with tension. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud, gasp, or simply flee. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, unsure whether they should keep rolling or cut away from the unfolding disaster. Depp took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice had regained some of its earlier control, though the underlying fury was still there. You want honesty, Seth? Here's some honesty for you. This conversation, this whole setup, it says more about you than it ever could about me. The two men stood locked in a battle of wills, neither willing to back down from what had become far more than a simple interview gone wrong. The studio lights seemed to burn hotter, casting harsh shadows across both their faces as the confrontation reached its boiling point. Meyers, perhaps sensing he had pushed too far, made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. Look, Johnny, Meyers said, his voice taking on a false tone of reasonableness. Maybe we should take a step back here. This is getting a little heated, and I think we're both saying things we might regret. Depp's eyes narrowed at the sudden shift in tone. Regret? The only thing I regret, Seth, is agreeing to come on this show in the first place. You invited me here under false pretenses, and now you want to play the reasonable host? It's a little late for that, don't you think? False pretenses. Meyers laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. I told you we were going to have a conversation. That's exactly what we're having. No, Depp said firmly, his voice cutting through Meyers' attempt at deflection. A conversation requires mutual respect. What you've been doing is conducting an interrogation, trying to break me down for the entertainment of your audience. There's a difference, and deep down, you know it. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Some looked uncomfortable, others fascinated, but all were riveted by the raw emotion unfolding before them. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked about television moments in years. Meyers' mask slipped again, his frustration evident. You know what, Johnny? Maybe I am being tough on you, but somebody needs to be. Somebody needs to ask the hard questions that everyone else is too polite to ask. Hard questions. Depp's voice rose again, his control slipping once more. These aren't hard questions, Seth. These are character assassinations dressed up as journalism. You're not some crusading reporter holding me accountable. You're a talk show host who gets his kicks from humiliating his guests. I'm doing my job, Meyers shot back, his own voice getting louder. My job is to entertain my audience. And sometimes that means asking questions that make people uncomfortable. Depp stared at him for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with a mixture of disgust and pity. Your job is to entertain? Is that what you think this is? Entertainment? You're destroying someone for laughs, Seth. You're taking a human being and turning their pain into a punchline. Oh, spare me the victim act, Meyers snapped, his patience finally exhausted. You're a public figure, Johnny. You signed up for this when you became famous. If you can't handle the scrutiny, maybe you should have stayed in Kentucky and kept doing community theater. The words were like a slap across the face. Depp went very still, his entire body tensing as the insult hit home. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. Community theater? Is that supposed to be an insult? Because some of the most honest, passionate performances I've ever seen have been on community theater stages. At least those actors perform because they love the craft, not because they're desperate for attention. Desperate for attention? Meyers laughed harshly. That's rich coming from someone whose entire career has been built on bizarre characters and eccentric behavior. You want to talk about desperate for attention? Depp's face flushed with anger, but his voice remained controlled. My characters, my choices, they come from a place of creativity and passion. Everything I do is in service of the story, the art. But you? Everything you do is in service of your own ego. My ego? Meyers stood up straighter, his own anger flaring. At least I'm still relevant. At least people still want to work with me. Can you say the same? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Depp stared at Meyers for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. The anger was still there, but it was joined by something else, something deeper and more profound. Disappointment, sadness, and finally, resolution. You know what, Seth? Depp said quietly, his voice suddenly calm. You're right about one thing. People do still want to work with you. But the question is, what kind of people? Because anyone with integrity, anyone with genuine talent or creativity, they can see exactly what you are. He began to move away from his chair, his movements deliberate and purposeful. You're a predator who feeds on vulnerability. You invite people onto your show, make them feel comfortable, and then you attack them when they're defenseless. That's not entertainment, Seth. That's cruelty. Meyers seemed to realize he was losing control of the situation. Johnny, wait. Look, maybe I came on a little strong, but no. Depp's voice cut through Meyers' attempt to backtrack like a blade. There's no but here. There's no excuse for what you've done tonight. You had a choice, Seth. You could have been kind. You could have been respectful. You could have actually tried to have a real conversation. Instead, you chose to be vicious. He was walking toward the edge of the stage now, his long coat flowing behind him like a cape. The audience watched in stunned silence as one of Hollywood's most iconic actors prepared to make his exit. And you know what the saddest part is? Depp continued, his voice carrying clearly through the silent studio. You probably think you've won something here tonight. You probably think you've scored some kind of victory by breaking me down, by making me lose my temper. But all you've really done is shown everyone exactly who you are. Meyers made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Johnny, come on. This is television. We're both professionals here. Let's sit back down and finish the interview properly. Depp turned back to face him one final time, and his smile was sad and knowing. Finish the interview? Seth, this interview was over the moment you decided that cruelty was more important than humanity. I won't be part of your circus anymore. He began walking toward the exit, his footsteps echoing through the stunned silence of the studio. The Cameras followed his movement, capturing every step of his dramatic departure. As he reached the edge of the stage, he paused and looked back at Meyers one final time. "You know, Seth," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "I came here tonight hoping to have a real conversation about art, about creativity, about the things that matter. Instead, I found myself face to face with everything that's wrong with this industry. Congratulations. You've proven your point perfectly." With that, Johnny Depp walked off the stage, leaving behind a stunned studio audience, a flustered host, and what would undoubtedly become one of the most controversial moments in late-night television history. The cameras captured his final exit, his silhouette disappearing into the darkness beyond the studio lights, while Seth Meyers stood alone behind his desk, the weight of what had just transpired slowly sinking in. The silence stretched on for several more seconds before Meyers finally attempted to regain his composure, but the damage was done. The interview that was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance had become something much darker, a raw display of the ugliest aspects of celebrity culture and media manipulation. What did you think of this explosive confrontation? Did Seth Meyers go too far, or was he just doing his job as a talk show host? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more shocking celebrity moments like this one. What other celebrity interviews do you think went completely off the rails?